Once digestion is more or less finished in the oral cavity, we swallow the food. And swallowing is the process where the food that was ingested in the oral cavity passes through the esophagus into the stomach. Now, why can't we go just from the oral cavity to the stomach? Because in this part of the body, we have the heart and lungs in the thoracic cavity. So the whole purpose of the esophagus is to get us from where we ingest the food to where we can begin the real process of breaking it down, but without getting in the way of the heart and lungs. So this is approximately where the diaphragm is, right where the esophagus becomes the stomach. When we swallow, our tongue pushes the food bolus toward and into the esophagus. Because the sphincter here, the upper esophageal sphincter, is made of skeletal muscle and therefore has voluntary control, we can anticipate swallowing, which opens the upper esophageal sphincter and allows the substance to move into the esophagus. After the food moves into the esophagus, the sphincter closes so that air doesn't enter. Now, some air does enter, and in fact, the faster you eat and swallow, the more likely you are to take in air, which is why you tend to burp more when you've eaten rapidly. Peristalsis is the name for how the muscularis of the GI tract contracts to move substances towards the anus. And we're going to look at that a little more closely in a bit. But the muscles of the tube here are contracting to push the food towards the stomach, but it has to pass through this next sphincter. Now, you may recall from the respiratory system that there's also the respiratory tube here, the pharynx, larynx, and trachea. And the paths cross each other. So an important part of swallowing is that the glottis, or the opening to the larynx and trachea, closes. If you put your hand on the front of your neck and swallow, you will actually feel the what's called the Adam's apple, or the cartilage that makes up the larynx. You'll feel it rise up. That's because every time you swallow, the muscles that position the larynx lift the larynx up and close the glottis so that food doesn't go down the wrong pipe. The epiglottis also kind of it doesn't cover the glottis, but it directs food around the opening, kind of like an umbrella redirects rain. After we get to the end of the esophagus and move into the stomach, the sphincter has to open to let it in. Then the lower esophageal sphincter closes so that stomach acid doesn't get into the esophagus. This sphincter is operated by smooth muscle, so we're not even aware of it doing its job. Now, if your lower esophageal sphincter is leaky, it doesn't close all the way, then it can cause you to develop GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease. So if the lower esophageal sphincter fails to close properly, the gastric acid is going to leak into the esophagus. And despite the fact that the esophagus is covered with stratified squamous epithelial tissue, which helps to prevent abrasion, it still is not sufficiently protected against acid. That requires extra. So this tissue gets burned, damaged, and therefore has to be replaced more frequently. And the more frequently that a tissue or a cell has to be replaced, the more opportunities there are for mutations to occur. And those mutations can ultimately lead to cells that don't wait for permission to divide, instead just do it whenever they feel like it. And that is called cancer. Now, the esophagus uses peristalsis to move the food along the tube, and really the entire rest of the digestive tract uses peristalsis as well, and it looks more or less the same. So, in peristalsis, the circular muscle layer contracts, which prevents the bolus from moving backwards. And then the longitudinal layer contracts, which moves the bolus forward. Or it's kind of like scrunching up a sock before you put it on your leg. It's really moving the muscle out of the way of the bolus. In any case, this process continues and moves the bolus towards the anus.